Sometimes, life brings surprises you never see coming. I'm Lisa, a 32-year-old woman, married to Brian, and together we have a 5-year-old son, Caleb. Our life in our suburban home was what many would call a dream, stable, predictable, and filled with love. Brian and I had been together since college, and through all the ups and downs, we always managed to find our way back to each other. But when Brian's stepbrother, Jake, moved in with us, everything I thought I knew about my life and my marriage began to unravel. Jake and Brian weren't particularly close growing up. They were stepbrothers, but more like distant acquaintances who only saw each other during holidays or family events. Jake was the rebellious type, always getting into trouble, moving from job to job, and never quite settling down. But when he lost his job and apartment all at once, Brian, being the kind-hearted man he is, offered Jake a place to stay until he got back on his feet. I wasn't thrilled about it, but how could I say no? He was family, after all. From the moment Jake moved in, things felt different. It wasn't that he was a bad house guest. He was polite, kept to himself, and even helped out around the house. But there was something about his presence that threw me off balance. Jake was charming, with a roguish smile and an air of confidence that was hard to ignore. He was the opposite of Brian in so many ways, and that contrast was both intriguing and unsettling. One evening, Brian had to work late, and it was just Jake and me in the house. Caleb was already in bed, and I was cleaning up the kitchen when Jake wandered in, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. He leaned against the counter, watching me as I washed the dishes. "You know, Lisa," he said, breaking the silence. "You've got a pretty sweet setup here. Nice house, great kid, a husband who adores you. You're living the dream." I laughed softly, shrugging. "Yeah, I guess so. But it's not always perfect. There's a lot of hard work behind the scenes." Jake nodded, his gaze intense. "Still, you make it look easy. I've been in a lot of places, seen a lot of people, but I've never met anyone quite like you." I felt my cheeks warm under his scrutiny. Jake had a way of making you feel like the only person in the room, and it was disarming. I shook my head, trying to brush off the compliment. "Thanks, Jake. But I'm just doing my best, like everyone else." He stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine. "No, really. You're different. Stronger, more grounded." "It's attractive." The way he said it made my heart skip a beat. I could feel the tension building between us, the space suddenly feeling too small. I tried to laugh it off, reaching for a towel to dry my hands. "You're just saying that because you're stuck here with us." But Jake didn't laugh. Instead, he reached out and gently took the towel from my hands, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through me. I pulled back, my mind racing. This was Brian's stepbrother. This was wrong. "Jake, we can't," I started, my voice shaky. But he just held up his hands in surrender. "Relax, Lisa. I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I don't know. I just wanted you to know that someone sees you." His words hung in the air, heavy and lingering. I mumbled something about needing to finish cleaning up and hurried out of the kitchen, my heart pounding. For the next few days, I avoided being alone with Jake. I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze. The way his words made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was confusing, and I didn't know how to handle it. Brian, oblivious to the growing tension, continued to work late hours, leaving me and Jake to navigate this awkward new dynamic. I tried to focus on Caleb, on maintaining some sense of normalcy, but every time Jake walked into the room, I felt that pull, that electric charge that was impossible to ignore. One rainy afternoon, Brian was stuck at the office due to a big project, and Caleb was busy with a cartoon marathon in the living room. I decided to tackle some organizing in the garage, a project I'd been putting off for weeks. As I sifted through old boxes and piles of forgotten items, Jake appeared at the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. "Need some help?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. I hesitated but nodded. "Sure. There's a lot of junk in here, and I could use the extra hands." We worked side by side in relative silence, the sound of rain pattering against the roof. It was strangely peaceful, and for a moment, it felt like we were just two people doing a mundane task. But as I reached for a heavy box on the top shelf, I felt it wobble, and Jake quickly stepped behind me, his hands on my waist to steady me. "You've got to be careful," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. I froze, the closeness sending my senses into overdrive. I could feel his chest against my back, his hands firm but gentle, and suddenly the garage felt like the smallest space in the world. "Jake," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "You should let go." He didn't move, his grip remaining steady as he spoke softly. "I know this is wrong, but being around you, it's messing with my head." I turned slightly, meeting his gaze. His eyes were filled with a mixture of guilt and longing that mirrored my own feelings. We were teetering on the edge of something dangerous, and I knew that one wrong move could send us tumbling over. "Jake, we can't do this," I said, my voice firmer this time. "Brian, he trusts us. This isn't fair to him." Jake nodded slowly, his hands finally dropping away from me. "You're right. I'm sorry, Lisa. I never meant to make things complicated." We stood there, the tension still thick between us, but the moment had passed. I turned back to my task, my hands shaking as I tried to refocus. Jake left the garage without another word, and I was left alone with the sound of the rain and my racing thoughts. For the next few days, Jake kept his distance. He was polite, friendly, but the easy camaraderie we'd shared was gone, replaced by a careful detachment. I should have been relieved, but instead, I found myself missing his presence, the way he seemed to understand me without needing to say much. I hated myself for it. I hated that I was letting these feelings disrupt the life I'd worked so hard to build. But the more I tried to push it away, the more it consumed me. I found myself replaying every interaction, every shared glance, every almost touch. It was like a song stuck in my head, looping over and over with no way to turn it off. One night, Brian was home, and we were watching a movie together. Jake had gone out, saying he needed to clear his head. I tried to focus on the film, but my mind kept wandering, my eyes flicking to the clock every few minutes. Brian noticed my distraction, pausing the movie and turning to me with a concerned look. "Hey, you okay? You've been a little out of it lately." I forced a smile, shaking my head. "Yeah, just tired, I guess. It's been a long week." He nodded, pulling me closer. "I get it. Work's been crazy, and having Jake here, I know it's a lot. But he'll be out of our hair soon enough. Just a few more days, right?" I nodded again, resting my head on his shoulder, trying to find comfort in his familiar presence. But all I could think about was Jake, where he was, what he was doing, and why I couldn't seem to get him out of my head. The night Jake left for good, he didn't say much. He packed his bags, gave Caleb a high five, and thanked Brian for letting him crash. But when he turned to me, his eyes lingered a moment too long, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had happened, and everything that hadn't. I watched him drive away, a mix of relief and regret swirling inside me. I wanted to tell Brian everything, to confess the way Jake had made me feel, to own up to the lines I'd almost crossed. But I couldn't. It felt like too much, like admitting it out loud would make it all too real. So I buried it, hoping that with time, the feelings would fade. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. Brian and I found our rhythm again, and Caleb filled our days with laughter and chaos. But in the quiet moments, when the house was still and my mind wandered, I couldn't help but think of Jake. I wondered where he was, what he was doing, and if he ever thought of me. I knew it was wrong. I knew that longing for someone who wasn't my husband was a betrayal, even if nothing physical had ever happened. But feelings don't always follow logic, and mine were tangled up in a mess of what-ifs and almosts. In the end, I chose to focus on my family. I poured my energy into being the best wife and mother I could be, determined to make things right. But there was a part of me that would always remember those stolen moments with Jake. The looks, the almost touches, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Maybe that's the thing about temptation. It's not always about what you do, but what you feel. And sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones that happen inside your own heart. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that you can't always control who you're drawn to. But you can control what you do about it. You can choose to stay true to the people who matter most, to fight for the life you've built, even when the pull of something new and exciting threatens to tear it all apart. So, if you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, remember this: you have a choice. And sometimes, the right choice isn't the easy one. But it's the one that will bring you back to the people who love you, the people who need you, and the life you've worked so hard to create. Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters.